steady rise in
This
COVID
pandemic
cases
is
since reopening
finally torn back to
Hello and welcome to the fourth and possibly final episode of the Avirus podcast. I'm Luza Twersky.
And I'm Malky Goldman.
So we have a very special guest. As you guys know, in the first episode, we announced that we're looking for an OTD or from economist. We were having a hard time finding one. Apparently, people who are from or leave the community, they go into different fields. And economics is not apparently a very popular one, so it was hard to dig one up. But we found one.
Perfect one.
We found the perfect one. We found the perfect one. We found someone who is not only like from, but also has an incredibly fascinating background story. Anyway, without further ado, we are speaking today with Professor Meylech Viswanath, whose Yiddish name is Dr. Meylech Viswanath, and he is a professor of economics at Pace University. He grew up in India, and he is a frum Jew, speaks fluent Yiddish, is a heimische Chevreman.
Yeah.
And he is an economist, and he really knows his shit. And we got to have an incredibly fascinating conversation that doesn't really focus that much on the coronavirus.
Officially, we were gonna completely focus on coronavirus, but then we got so carried away with our obsession with economics and just talked about that. And we could have gone on and on for 5 hours, but we stopped.
Yeah, we stopped at a certain point when we realized that we've been talking for an hour and a half. And even if we edit it very, very, very creatively and very well, it would probably still be over an hour long. And that's what ended up happening. But we really hope that you enjoyed this conversation and you learned something. I think we cover a lot of ground in terms of some of the coronavirus impacts on the economy, but also like the impact of other financial crises on the previous financial crises. We know, so we kind of like go down a rabbit hole. I found it fascinating to talk about it. I hope you find it as interesting to listen to. So here you go. Professor, thank you so much for coming on.
Sure.
Let's get into this a little bit. Before we get into the questions, I'm really fascinated by your background. To me, it doesn't fully compute how we came across a Yiddish-speaking Indian Jew. So, and I think a lot of people will be fascinated, but I don't necessarily want to get into too much into the biography. But if you can give us a little bit of an idea of your journey and where you come from and who you are and what you do, and give us a little bit of a snapshot of that, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. I was born in India, and I grew up in India, and I went to school. Actually, went to college in India as well, in Bombay. It used to be called Bombay, then now it's called Mumbai. And then when I was about 20, slightly before I was 20, I came to this country. I came to study. I went to the University of Kentucky. I got an MBA there. And then I decided that I was interested in research. And I enrolled in a PhD program at the University of Chicago. And that's how, and I spent about, quite a few years there. And then I got my PhD and I came to the East Coast. I taught at Rutgers for a few years, and then I moved to Pace University. So that's how I came to be where I am now. And I've been in Pace since 1995, and I've been in New York City since 1984, so quite a bit of time. And I live in Teaneck, New Jersey, just on the other side of the river. Now, in terms of my being Yiddish speaking, I'm very interested in languages. I've always been interested in languages. And even in India, we had French in school, but I wanted to really improve my French, so I took classes at the Alliance Française, which is an organization somewhat affiliated with the French government. And they give classes on French language and culture all over the world. And that's how I started learning French first. And then I also took classes at what's essentially the Goethe Institute in in Mumbai. That's a German language institute. It's also affiliated with the German government, I believe. So, when I left India, I knew these two foreign languages. English, I'm not even considering foreign language because I did all my studies in English, and
Right.
English is an official language in India.
Right.
Besides in Bombay, actually, Bombay is a very multicultural and cosmopolitan city, just like New York. And there are probably upwards of 100 languages that's spoken that are spoken in Bombay. So one heard a lot of languages, and my family is actually from South India.
Yeah.
So the language that we spoke at home, was different from the language on the street. And when I came to the United States, I continued learning a lot of different languages. And, I studied Hebrew, and I already had my Hebrew and my German at that time. And then when I came across Yiddish, that was like a revelation because the story I like to tell people is I was walking down 33rd Street in New York
Yeah.
City. At the time, you had the Arbiter Ring building there,
Yeah.
the Workman Circle.
Yeah.
And I saw this, the name Arbiter Ring, I believe, was on the facade of the building. And I tried to read it, and, I mean, it was in Hebrew characters, right?
That's
But
very.
it's not German, right? So,
That's so
anyway,
fun. Yeah.
yeah. So then I learned Yiddish, and at the Columbia summer program, and then I met a lot of other people who were Yiddish speaking, and then I met my wife, whose mother tongue is Yiddish, and that's how I come to Yiddish. And now that's the main language that my wife and I use to communicate with each other.
That's
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. That's so fascinating. And I know you have some connection to the Jewish community in Mumbai. I read something that you were the translator for the negotiators during the Mumbai terror attack.
Yes, yes. But before that, I want to mention that my mother tongue is called Tamil. It's
Yeah.
from South India. And fun fact: there are actually a few words in Tanakh, in the Jewish Bible, that are from Tamil.
Oh
For
wow.
example,
Oh, wow.
the Hebrew word, kofi, that is from Sanskrit actually, but it's also used in Tamil. But the word tuki, which in modern Hebrew means parrot,
Mm-hmm.
that is an old Tamil word. So
Wow.
it's some interesting thing. Yeah. So my kids are multilingual, but one of some of the languages that they all speak include Yiddish and Tamil and English. So that's okay. So that's a little bit more about the linguistic background. Now, the thing that you were asking about, yeah. Uh, so when when there was a terrorist attack in Mumbai, um, and it turned out, ultimately, we found out that these terrorists had come from Pakistan, and they took over the Taj Mahal Hotel
Yeah.
and another location as well. But one of the locations that they took over was Chabad in Mumbai.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so they found the cell phone of the rabbi, and they dialed the cell phone. I guess I'm not sure exactly what they were trying to do. Maybe try to get some propaganda or something like that. And the Chabad people here picked up the phone, and they realized they couldn't talk to those guys, so they weren't even sure, I think, what language that was. So they sort of sent the word around through the uh, uh, Jewish grapevine to find out if there was somebody, preferably Jewish, who would be able to speak that language.
Right.
And I think it was the Princeton Chabad or Princeton Hillel. Somehow through them, the word got to one of my nephews, and then it got to me, and then I communicated with Chabad, and basically, yeah, as you mentioned, I was a translator
Right. And they were
from.
Pashto, right?
No, it was Urdu.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm very. This is all very confusing to me because I know that India has like a ton of like regional languages and then and Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they all also have different regional languages. So yeah. So yeah, it's very
right. But Urdu slash Hindi, they're pretty much the same language, sort of like, yeah, Litvish Galiciana, something like that, you could say. Um,
right.
so that spoke Urdu is in fact the national language of Pakistan, and it's spoken. The Hindi variant is spoken pretty much all over North India, and a lot of people all over India know it because of Bollywood, Hindi films. That since Bollywood films are watched all over India, so a
Yeah.
lot of people know that language, at least to some extent, anyway. So it's
Yeah.
it's a major language, Hindi Urdu.
Yeah, so to get back to Corona and the disaster that we're living in right now,
Right.
we wanted to ask you some questions. So, do you think that this is different than any other recession?
Yeah, I think so.
How?
Well, the first thing is that the impact of this recession is much greater than in any previous recession. The first day the news pretty much hit the market, the stock market dropped precipitously, much more than in any other situation. Of course, since then it's come back up, but that's for different reasons. And the drop in GDP has also been much more than in previous recessions. Like, for example, even the 2008 one, or even the 1930s one. Um, I, but I think another way this is also different is that previous recessions were caused by, maybe some kind of financial event like a bank run, or in the 2008 event, um, chronic
The subprime mortgages.
subprime mortgages, exactly, or excessive debt or something like that.
Mhm.
What we have now is more like a supply side um, event. So I think it's also like a real event, right, as opposed to a financial event.
Right.
Uh, like subprime mortgage thing. So that has to do with the financial markets. So the comparison that I would make between this recession and the previous ones, one previous one in particular, is the oil shock. Because the 1973 oil shock also, that was caused by restructuring, caused by political events, the oil industry, the power structure changed, and that changed the price of oil drastically. So in that,
Are you talking about the 1970s oil crisis?
yes, right. Right. So that then, because the price suddenly shot up, so that was caused it was sort of like a supply shock as opposed to a demand shock, and that ultimately, of course, that would then come to affect demand as well. But that's how the initial shock came in, and in this case, it's also so, and that was a real event here and not a financial event. This time also, it's a real event, right? This major medical exigency then causes all kinds of changes in economic activity. So that's a first comparison that I would make. How it's similar in some sense to the 1970s oil shock, but different from most of the other recessions that we have had. The other thing is that after the oil shock, what happened was that the entire world had to readjust. They had to figure out how to use less oil because the price of oil was so high, they couldn't just continue doing things the way they had been doing. And then also there were changes in production technologies, also search for new sources of oil, which is why we have, so many alternative energy sources now than there used to be.
Gas, like
And
natural gas, shale.
exactly, yes, yeah. And I think here also what we are going to, what's going to happen is, I mean, it's not going to be that whether it's a U-shaped recovery or a V-shaped recovery. It's not going to be that at some point in time, uh, 2 months down the road, 6 months down the road, whatever, that we're going to go back to the way the world was before. I think there's going to be a continuing appreciation that these kinds of viruses could wreak havoc.
Right.
And so, people are going to find ways of organizing the economy where it's not necessary for everybody to be next to each other in physical proximity.
Right.
And so I think the way people do business, the way things are organized, are going to be affected to a great extent. And I think that also is similar to what happened after the 90s oil shock. So, these are a couple of ways in which I think this current emergency is structurally different from previous ones, besides the fact that, it's affected economic activity to a greater extent right now.
So you're saying that what makes this different is that it's, first of all, it's steeper. So the dive is a lot steeper than 2008, and you're saying it's even steeper than the depression in 1920s.
Yes.
Wow.
Right. Is that mostly because it's a supply side recession? In case people don't understand, can you just give us like a very short primer on a supply side recession and what that means and how that works and how it's different than I want to add to that actually. And also, how come we have a supply side recession where people aren't buying stuff, and how come prices haven't gone down?
Okay. So, I mean, I did use the term supply side, but mostly to contrast it with the demand side recession that we had previously. So previously, and then simultaneously with that, along with that, you have the financial shock versus the real shock,
Right.
right? So sort of real shock slash supply side, financial shock slash demand side. So it is not that when you have real shock, then when you have a supply side shock, that nothing then happens to demand, right? When there is a supply side shock, eventually the level of economic activity goes down, and that's going to affect demand as well.
Right.
So it's just a question of what originated the crisis. So if, let's say, the mortgage crisis, a financial shock originated the crisis, and it caused a, drop in confidence, then you could build up confidence, and you could build up people's willingness to invest and buy, and that would increase demand, and the economy would go back to where it might have been before.
Right.
But when you have this kind of real shock, right, it's kind of what I'm calling a supply side shock, maybe not the precise term, but a real shock, right? It's not just something in people's minds. It's not just that, we could say, oh, let's get people um,
Buying stuff.
more trusting. Yeah, right. And then get them to buy. No, that's not, that won't, that won't be sufficient, because there are real things that are happening out there.
Right.
I mean, you could, of course, convince people that, oh, this coronavirus has gone away. And maybe you could, but then they go out there and it's going to hit them.
Right. You can give movie tickets away for free and people still won't go to the movies.
Exactly.
Right. Or if they go, pretty soon they'll figure out it was a bad decision.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah, I think that's a big difference. Um, Now, the thing about prices not having been affected, I mean, I think partly it's because of societal pressure. In fact, in the early days, we did see, right, that prices of goods did shoot up, price of essential goods, prices of masks, prices of flour and things like that. They did shoot up, or at least they went up, to some amount. I mean, in the case of masks, they went up like crazy amounts. But I think it's, socially it would not have been acceptable for people to actually make money in that way, and there was social pushback, and so I think the price of those things went back down. Um, and so the other thing is that right now supply, after certain adjustment, supply of things went down, but demand also went down. So there was no need for the price to adjust.
Right. That's
So,
what I was thinking, is that that maybe like clothing stores might have excess inventory of stuff, but
Yeah.
there's no point in lowering the price if no one is coming to buy them, right? And also,
yeah,
and there's also like the coronavirus did in some way affect the supply, because some factories are shut down, some industries are shut down, so maybe like um probably the ports are going slower, some probably international freight is moving slower and all that. So there could be a little bit of there could be a little bit of a crunch on the supply side as well, but it's mostly on the demand side.
right. What you said is right, that there's been an impact on supply. So if supply, as I said before, things in some sense could be said to have started on the supply side, but that then, because there was no demand for people's labor, therefore their incomes were lower, therefore they were then buying less.
Right.
So ultimately, then the level of production is lower because of the circumstances. People can't go to the factories. Um, Incomes are lower, therefore the demand is lower. So except for an early few weeks when you had all this excess inventory, right? In
Yeah.
which case, during which time there was some effect on prices. Ultimately, what you have now is a situation where there's lower demand, lower supply, and prices themselves don't haven't taken a hit. The other thing is, I mean, I'm not sure that companies might necessarily want to cut their prices that much, because there might be implications about how their products are going to be viewed
Right.
going forward also.
Yeah.
But essentially, it's a thing about, you have like a new equilibrium with lower demand and lower supply. So if it were only on one side, then the price would be adjusted.
Right. I remember when I worked in fashion, we never had a sale because we didn't want to diffuse the value of the brand. So like if we start making things cheaper, I was working for a luxury fashion brand, and it would devalue our brand if we start selling cheaper suits or something like that. So that makes sense in terms of not lowering prices. Yeah.
Right. But your question could be interpreted, in a slightly different way. Why didn't stock prices go down? I mean, they did go down briefly, right? But they, pretty much came up, like last week. They're pretty much up to the point where they had been before the crisis hit.
Right.
And that's a little bit of a puzzle. Partly it has to do with the fact that stock prices, don't just reflect the current economic activity.
Yeah, I want to pause you there, because I think that's a very very it's actually it wasn't on the list of questions, but because we kind of like veered into that, I do want to ask about that. And I think a lot of people don't understand it. I would love, if this can be explained in a to the listeners in plain English so they understand it. the stock market is not the economy. Like the numbers, the Dow Jones doesn't necessarily reflect the reality on the ground. Um, can you explain to people why that is, if it's true, and what is the stock market, and what indicator does the stock market give that people give it so much credence?
Okay. So I wouldn't say that the stock market is not the economy. In a certain sense, they are actually very, very closely related. But I was thinking, as we were talking, I was thinking of what might be a good like marshal, like a parable.
Yeah.
So if you have a car, and let's say that something's wrong with the car, and right now it's not going anywhere. So right now, let's say you want to go to the store to buy something, the car is useless,
Right.
right? So you could say, in some sense, the value of the car to you right now is useless, is zero. But it could be fixed. So if somebody wanted to buy the car off you, you won't sell it to the guy for $1. You would say, hey, right now I can't use it. That's true.
Right.
But I'm going to take it into the mechanic. Maybe I won't be able to use it for the next 2 weeks, but he's going to then fix it. And then I'm going to be able to use it. So, and maybe I'll be able to use it for the next 10 years, right?
Right.
So the value that I'm going to put on the car today is not just dependent upon what I can do with it today, but I'm going to look at what I'm going to be able to do with it 3 weeks from now, a month from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, etc. So that's the same thing as the stock market. So if you're comparing the stock market and economic activity at a certain point in time, like right now, economic activity is down.
Right.
But if you're talking about if you have a share of stock, let's say even in Marriott, the hotel industry, right? So if you have a share of stock in Marriott, maybe their profits today are not high. But if you have a share in Marriott, then next year they're going to be making profits. The year after that, they're going to be making profits. So if you're going to look at the value of the share of stock today, it's going to be it's going to take into account the value of all those future profits. Of course, a profit 10 years down the road of, let's say, $1 million is not the same as $1 million today. So it's going to have to be discounted to today's dollars, but it's still worth quite a bit. So that's why the stock market is still high. So, but there's still a couple other points to be made. One is that we said, I spoke earlier about the fact that economic activity is going to be affected because people are going to have to figure out ways of, production, etc., so that you don't have to have workers standing next to each other. So all that's going to be costly, right?
Right.
So one could say, there's going to be an impact on profits from now on, and that's going to be a little bit of a depressor of future profits. Therefore, the current stock price should go down as well. Now, and that kind of makes sense. But the amazing thing is that in a capitalist economy, where people are able to do lots of different things, they're really, really smart, and particularly in an economy like the United States, where you have lots of immigrants, so you have tons of ideas from all over the world. And now we might think, oh, how's the hotel industry going to work? How are universities going to operate if they can't have students sitting next to each other in class? Well, people are going to figure out all kinds of stuff that we might not even think of now.
Right.
So I think even though we might not know exactly what's going to happen in the future, but I think overall there is an understanding that the system is resilient. And I think that's why the stock prices haven't dropped. There's one other thing, though, which is not so good, which is that shares, which is what the stock market reflects, the level of stock market reflects the value of shares, equity shares, ownership of these large companies.
Yeah.
So most of those companies are probably going to be doing well. And so their share prices are high. But a lot of the people who don't have any share in the big companies, they have been affected quite a bit. So if you look at the value of the US economy as a whole, that might very well be lower right now. And I think even if you take into account the future resilience of the US economy, but the total value of the US economy, all the assets in the US economy, are, if you could break it down into, the human capital of disadvantaged people, blue collar workers, white collar workers, and then all these people who have a lot of money and own shares and all that, right? So the people that I mentioned earlier, they might still be taking a big hit because of the drop in the value of their labor
Right.
and the likely uh, depressed value of their labor even going forward. But the stock market doesn't reflect that.
Right.
Inequality in the US economy uh, is partly also the reason why the stock market's looking well.
Right. So, I mean, what's interesting to me is that you look at the stock market, and I mean, not this week. This week has not been going that great, and the end of last week. But before the end of last week, before the new jobs numbers came out, and after, especially after they came out, last jobs numbers, and it kind of went up. What's fascinating is that a regular person who has now been laid off and probably in a really bad position, and basically the majority of Americans who don't own stock, um, that that number, like the Dow Jones, means absolutely nothing to them. It didn't add any value. But if I'm understanding correctly, in a way, it added value to human capital in a way. It basically, the market is telling people that the value of your work is still high, even though you don't have it.
Well, unfortunately, I mean, it would be nice if that were the case, because then going forward, then people would be all back in a good state.
Right.
But uh, I think this is likely to accelerate something that we have already been seeing. That is, certain kinds of labor are valued tremendously, and certain other kinds are not valued as much. So, even before the coronavirus hit, we saw that the US economy, and to a certain extent, economies all over the world, were moving towards the service sector. So, people who could work in the service sector, people who had a lot of knowledge about how finance works, people who could work with computers, write software, come up with all kinds of ideas. Their value was going up.
Right.
On the other hand, people who only had ordinary labor, cooks in restaurants
Low
or
skill labor.
cashier. Yes, so relatively unskilled labor. So their value, the value of their labor was going down. And because you didn't have this kind of intermediate kind of labor, you didn't even have like middle level managers, you just have the top managers, and then you have simple labor, right? So their value was already going down. But I think now with the coronavirus, it's likely that you're going to have even more of a reliance on the internet, even more of a reliance on skills for which you need an university education.
Right.
And I think it might very well end up being that the income inequality and asset inequality is going to be worsened.
Wow. So, what's happening with all the money that is not being spent?
Well, when the government says, okay, here's so much money that we are going to set aside that is available to be spent, and according to one estimate was like $3 trillion. This number is from about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. $3 trillion. So $3 trillion as a fraction of the US GDP in 2019, that was about 21 trillion.
Yeah.
So it's about 12%. So a tremendous amount of money was set aside to be spent on the economy. But it's not as if you actually take resources and put them aside. It's not as if you take workers and then you have them sit somewhere and they're doing nothing. It's not as if you're taking minerals or raw materials or machines and they're putting them in a room and they're just sitting there idle. It's not that.
Right.
Those things are all being used. But what has happened is when you had this set aside, you had the potential for all this money to be spent. So instead of being spent on all these things, like for example, that money was supposed to be spent on international pandemic aid. That was one of the things that Congress had set aside money for. It was supposed to be spent on medical research. It was supposed to be spent on giving people loans and handouts, people who are suffering. So all those people have not received the handout. So but the resources are still around and they're being used for other things. So that's the sort of sad part.
Right, but no, I wonder also more that individually, people are not spending $10 a day for their lattes. They're not spending $15 for a lunch sandwich. All of the money that is not going anywhere individually as well. I know that it's much more complicated than like, people are not shopping. Where people are getting unemployment, they're getting money from the government, but are not going on vacation, are not shopping. They're not necessarily spending the same amount that we are usually spending.
Right. So there are two things. I mean, an important reason why people are not spending is because they don't have the money, right? But the other reason is that there is to a certain extent there is this issue of confidence as well. If you don't know what the world is going to be like, then you're not so quick to invest either.
Right.
But
you want to hold on to your money.
Right, but it's even more than that. We're not spending because we're not getting paid, but our boss is not paying us because he's not making money.
Right. Yeah.
Well, so the thing is, it's sort of a little. So here's where the sort of parallel between a household and an economy kind of breaks down. So if you're talking about a household, and I have all this money, let's say you're talking about an individual, like Shimon, right? So
Right.
Shimon has all this money, and he might decide not to spend it, or yes, to spend it, right? So if he doesn't spend it, then he has those resources that are out there, and they're just sitting there, right? With an economy, sort of demand and supply sort of feed into each other. That's kind of what we were talking about, what you were saying, Malki, that if my boss is not paying me, then I don't have the resources, and then I'm not going to go out and spend, because I and many people like me are not going out to spend. Therefore, the boss also doesn't want to invest money. He doesn't want to, buy new stores, buy new machines, etc. And therefore, there's less money being spent on salaries, and therefore there's less demand, etc. So the thing is that you can have lots of different equilibria. So at each level, you can have supply being equal to demand. So you can have equilibrium, supply being equal to demand with low supply and low demand, right? And then people, not well off. You can have moderate supply, moderate demand, and people being moderately well off. And you can have the economy going in full gear, where supply is high, demand is high, and everybody's really well off.
Right.
So right now we're kind of at the bottom level. So it's not quite an issue of what's happening to the money. Why are people not doing anything with their money?
Right.
It's just that there's low demand and low supply.
Right. This gets to a little bit more of an existential and fundamental question about the U.S. economy, but it's kind of a segue. We're looking at this recession and the 2008 recession and all the downturns, especially in this recession. it's does America rely too much on a consumer-based economy? Because if you look at how well the economy was doing before coronavirus, it was doing really well. Even wages were a little bit up, but it was mostly a consumer-based economy. It was based on spending and people just buying and buying and buying more garbage. And because America, like we're away from the gold standard. We're a different economy than we were, 50 years ago. And does this does what happened now prove in some way, or like the recessions in the last 20 years, does that prove that in a consumer-based economy, an economy that is so dependent on people just borrowing and spending and borrowing and spending, that it's a bad idea?
I mean, that's a sort of complicated question.
I'm going to qualify that a little bit. So
Yeah,
the way me as a commoner,
yeah,
not an economist, I would look at business and the economy as something. Let's say, for example, if I need milk, I go to the grocery. I go to the grocery that gives me the best price and the best service, and I buy milk. And this is a need, something I need, whether it's a car or clothes or milk or whatever. And the economy is based on providing goods and services at a high level so people buy that stuff. But it's very different than inflating demand, than instead of selling things that people need or maybe even want, but trying to make people want it more so they buy more. It seems like a lot of the US economy is literally standing on that. It's like, how do we get people to buy clothes they don't need? How do we get them to get a car loan for 7 years, which they shouldn't get? How do we advertise and manipulate people into just overspending? So to me, like, that's the question of, like, is this a consumption based economy, an economy that relies so much on people overspending? Is that
right.
fundamentally a bad idea?
Okay. um, so I think you have to think about what the alternative is.
Mm,
And I mean, you sort of got at that, but if you wanted to say, okay, it's not going to be demand that's going to be driving the economy. It's going to be, what people need. So, we're going to produce things that people need, and then, they would buy them, because they'd have, there'd be some kind of wealth in the economy. They would use that to buy those goods, and that would be it. So you could do it that way. But, that, and I'm not necessarily saying it as a negative thing, but
right,
that would be like a Soviet economy, right? So in the Soviet Union, that's what they tried to do. They said, I mean, they also did for other reasons, ideological reasons, but also to make sure that nobody was better than anybody else. So they said, we're going to figure out what people need, and then we're going to produce them, and then we'll allocate them to people,
right,
right? The problem with that, what happened was there are two things. One is that, suppose circumstances changed and people needed more, say, clothes, or, maybe there was global warming. And
right,
let's say, people needed different kinds of clothes, right? So, how does the government decide what are the new needs now? So, in the Soviet Union, it was impossible because, there was no way to find out what people actually needed. So, there was massive sort of disjunctions between what was produced and what people needed, and the way that was essentially resolved was by people waiting in line to get things, and also things didn't progress very well. With the U.S. economy or any kind of capitalist economy, where people bid for things by saying, I'm willing to pay this, I'm willing to pay more or less, right?
right,
So prices send signals, and those signals are then used by manufacturers, by retailers, to decide what they should produce and what they should not produce.
right,
So that's the first thing. The second thing is that because of this capitalist arrangement of the economy, the better you do the better off you are, right? So if you come up with a great way of adjusting your inventory so that you don't keep lots and stuff in your warehouses, when you don't need to, then you're able to provide the same services with less inventory, right?
Right.
Or you figure out how to manufacture something using less energy, right? So that's going to mean higher profit for you. So you always have an incentive to do things better and better. But now the problem is that you have an incentive, as you were saying earlier, you have an incentive to get people to buy more and more, because the more you can get them to buy, the better off you are.
Right.
Right? So that's the thing about the demand based economy. In some sense, you're right. Everybody might be better off if they weren't simply sort of trying to get more and more and more, and sort of competing against each other.
Right. Well, the question I was asking, it's more like, is there a ceiling to this? That's my question. Obviously, capitalism has created an incredible amount of wealth, an incredible amount of comfort for people all over the world, and pulled tons of people out of poverty, and gave people incredible wealth. But
Yeah.
is there a ceiling to that? Is there a certain point where you go like, okay, everybody, you don't need to take this any further, okay? It's like it's time to like somewhat tamp this down and kind of like, everybody cool down. Your company does not need to grow every quarter. It just needs to make a profit, and it's just like everybody like take a step back. Like that's why my question is like, has this gone too far?
Well, I would agree with you. But the thing is that, not everybody agrees with that.
Right.
There are, on your side, there's a lot of evidence that shows that, as your incomes get higher, your happiness also gets higher. However,
Up to a certain point.
exactly, like about 75, $100,000, and beyond that, it actually even goes down.
Right.
Right? So it's absolutely right what you're saying. That you don't need that much. In 1930, the economist John Maynard Keynes,
Yeah.
he predicted that over the next century, the economy would become so productive that people wouldn't need to work at all. And you know what? He's actually right. So, right now, the amount of foodstuffs that we have is enough to feed all the people in the world comfortably, and not even number of people today. Even it's been estimated till 2050, whatever the increase in population might be, even at that stage, everybody would have enough food, right? But because of the advantages of the capitalist system, right? Because giving people incentives to do things better and in some sense create wealth. So, and as you pointed out, part of that is getting people to consume more and more and more. Now, it is possible to actually have your cake and eat it too. But the way to do it would be for people to agree that they don't need more. In other words, there's got to be some kind of a social compact. People say, maybe this would work. One way it would work, for example, if everybody became religious, right?
Yeah, this is exactly what we were thinking about. The Hasidim,
Yeah.
are they the only people who are doing capitalism the correct way? Like, look at B&H. It's a perfect example of a successful company that is not trying to take over the world.
Well, that's true. I mean, I'm not sure that B&H has done everything well. There were some problems with B&H and their employees.
Yeah.
They were taken to court.
I used to work there, and I still have a brother who works there. Two
Right.
brothers.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I'm sure. I mean, unfortunately, I mean, I live in Ditmas Park, and every little cafe has employees problems, and everyone is suing each other. But I'm just thinking more as a whole of they could try to open another chain and another chain.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I don't necessarily want to say B&H is a solution,
Right.
or slaughterhouse in Iowa, etc. I mean, each group has their issues, but I think what you need is, I'm just giving religion as a possible solution, because many religions do say this, right? They say, what's that? Ezehu Ashir mi shehu samyak bechalko, right?
Right.
Who's rich, he's a person who's satisfied with his lot, right?
Right.
And Christianity also says same thing, not focus on the things that you're going to get in this world. And Islam, Hinduism, many religions say that, right? So that's why I suggest it might be possible to use that, but it doesn't have to even be religion. There are many like Scandinavian countries where there is an agreement. There seems to be, people agree we don't all have to be richer and richer and richer, that there's certain level of consumption that's enough. And maybe at that point, from that point on, maybe we'll focus on being richer in a cultural sense, reading more literature, enriching our minds and things like that. But it's got to be something where one, people have to agree that the way the current capitalist system works is not necessarily the best way, and we don't have to turn it into an idol. I think a lot of people, because of the history of capitalism in the United States and the contrast with the Soviet Union, they sort of seem to think that everything about the way the private enterprise works in the United States, everything is good. But that doesn't have to be the case. And I think societies, one way or the other, and I'm not sure exactly how it might happen, but they has to agree that we don't necessarily need more and more.
But I think it's also like, if you look at, I mean, to kind of like stick to the example of B&H, and I'm using that example because, first of all, I'm familiar with the business. I used to work there. I know the people who own it. But to me, it seems like it's a better way of doing business in general. It's better for the employees. It's better for the customers. It's better for the owners. Because if I think back to my days at B&H, both as a customer and as an employee, I can't think of any other retail store that has a starting pay of like $18 an hour with full benefits. And I have friends who've worked there for many years, and like, I'm talking about the sales floor, and they're making $30, $40 an hour after 10, 20 years. They're making a very good living. They get very good benefits, and it creates employee loyalty. It creates very high retention, which makes the employees more experienced and better at serving the customers. It seems to me like just like a win-win situation. If your focus is what you do and not growth necessarily, like just exponential growth, it's just better. I feel like the American economy, or at least, again, I'm not old enough to remember what it was like in the 70s or before that, but to me, it feels like the original idea was that was the original idea of the American economy. Make good stuff, treat people well, pay them nice middle class wages, and everybody wins. And I feel like we did that for a while, and then we stopped doing that, and it became about quarterly, 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 quarterly. And you look at all these other electronic stores or any other stores, you have unhappy employees being paid starvation wages. You walk into a Best Buy and you walk over to the camera aisle. The person who works there is 19 years old. He's been there for 3 months. He has no idea what the hell he's talking about. It seems to me like a lose-lose situation. And it goes to every industry. You have Uber. You got a bunch of inexperienced drivers who don't know what they're doing, getting paid starvation wages. At the same time, you have taxi drivers who know every nook and cranny in the city, and they are more expensive. So, like, it seems to me like the way the U.S. economy is being worked now, as opposed to like the way it was supposed to be, it's not working. It's bad. That was more of a.
I don't disagree with you. Again, I'm not sure that B&H was completely good on all fronts.
Oh yeah, I actually want to acknowledge that.
But
We're also not thinking about ethics. We're not thinking about ethically. It's just ideology.
no. But I mean, I completely accept the premise that you have, right?
I want to touch on the discrimination thing for a second.
Okay.
They have a serious issue with discrimination. There's no question about it. Even the people of color who work on the floor in the store, At least that was the case back when I was there, which was after the first settlement that they had. They started putting a lot of minorities in the store, but those were all from temp agencies. They were not B&H employees, and they were not getting paid B&H wages, and they were not getting B&H benefits. They were mostly contractors or temps that were literally just like to make it look more colorful. So B&H got serious issues on that end. But to talk just about the way of doing business, and I'm using them as an example.
A company like Ben and Jerry's, for example.
Right.
Right? I mean, that's another company where they care about their employees. So, yeah, there are certainly a lot of examples in the US economy. But the thing is, as you said, the owners have to make a decision that this is what they want to do.
Right.
And they should be willing to spread the wealth. But, I mean, unfortunately, that's not a model that's caught on everywhere.
Yeah. And I've been thinking for the last, ever since the 2008 recession, this thing has been bothering me. I've gotten the feeling that the world economy has turned into some kind of Ponzi scheme that could collapse any second in a way, because we've moved away from the gold standard. The entire U.S. economy and the world economy is held up by mostly debt and bonds and perceived value instead of something necessarily of actual value. And I feel everything is great as long as everything is working, but some event, like something could happen that could make this collapse. Am I completely nuts, or is that a legitimate thought to have?
Well, there are two things. The first thing I think is what we've already talked about, the fact that so much depends on demand being higher and higher and higher,
Right.
right? So this focus on consumption, that I think is a problem. The other thing is, and I'd be willing to say that's an unmitigated problem. The second thing is not partly it's good, partly it's bad, and that this has to do with the fact that the economy is much more integrated now than it has been for a long time. Actually, in the 20s, 30s of the last century, there was a lot of globalization, but for various reasons after the war, etc., the level of globalization went down. But now, once again, I mean, certainly, again, it's possible that the pendulum is going to swing. But say 10 years, till 10 years ago, for sure, um, you in the United States, consumers in the United States would buy things that were manufactured in China,
Right.
Vietnam, and you had the labor also moving from the Philippines to Europe, from Slovakia to Britain, all kinds of movements, right?
Mhm.
And so this was good because where you had an excess of labor, that labor could move somewhere else. Where you had people who had the best ideas, those ideas could be used to produce better quality commodities that could be sold elsewhere. So this kind of integration is good for everybody. But along with that, what that means is that, when there's something wrong that happens in one part of the world, now that's going to affect not just a small area, it's going to have a chain reaction, it's going to affect everybody else. And that's kind of what happened with the coronavirus.
Right.
If the US had remained nativist and not buying and selling all over the world, then it would have been affected as much.
Right.
But but I don't think we really want to go in that direction. And every country sort of keeps to itself.
Right. Well,
There are too many advantages.
right. Could we reach a point where like things could get so bad that treasury bonds are lose their value, or like we default on our debt? Could there be something that brings this house of cards down? Because we're living in a time where where the dollar has a perceived value and less of an actual value, and the economy is held up by all these basically bonds and debt, not just the government debt, but massive corporate debt and massive personal debt. Like, could something come in and just take one little Jenga piece out, and the whole thing just collapses?
Personally, I don't think the situation is as bad as sometimes looks like. It is true that, again, there could be sort of real shocks like the coronavirus that could bring the whole thing down. But that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about things that are somehow, inherent to the system that will cause everything to collapse.
Right.
That would be like,
Go, like, how high can it go? That's what I'm saying. Like Bernie Madoff eventually ran out of money to move around. You know,
yeah, so I don't think it's that kind of a situation, because the businesses have balance sheets.
right,
You have asset side and liability side. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, and I'll generalize that to the economy.
right,
So on the asset side of any business, right, you might have real estate that they have, you might have factories, and in some sense, you also have all the employees that they have, right? So those are all assets that the company has, right? And then by putting together the raw materials, the inventories, the space that they have where they operate, and the skills of their employees, using all those assets, you're able to generate value, and that value is then paid to all the claimants on the liability side of the balance sheet. That value then is paid over to equity holders and shareholders, etc. So that's for a company. So for the US economy as a whole, again, you can think in some sense in the same way. You could look at all the assets that are there in the US economy. And all the assets in the US economy would be all the people with all the human capital. It would have to do with all the minerals that are in the ground, oil. It would have to do with, trees, plants, the climate. All these sorts of things would be the assets, right? And human capital, of course, as I mentioned already, but that's going to be very, very important. And then on the liability side, in a certain sense, I mean, we're calling it liabilities, but really it's all by putting all the assets of the economy together, you have production of goods, but also of services, also of art, also of music, all these things. And then all those things are then being consumed by people,
right,
right? So if the whole thing was sort of a pack of cards, and it was all had to do with the liability side, had to do with debt and this and that and all that, then you wouldn't have the equivalent on the asset side.
hmm,
But that's not the case. As you yourself pointed out sometime back in our conversation, people actually have got better and better and better. Their lives, I mean, have got better. I mean, it is true compared to the maybe to the 60s, there's more inequality. And it's also possible, I mean, I think it is true that for many parts of the population, their children are probably not going to be as well off as they themselves are. But at the same time, we should not forget that in the 60s, not everything was hunky dory for everybody. People of color
right,
did not share to the same extent as white people. And also, if you look at what was happening in the rest of the world, to a certain extent, the U.S., which has been an imperialist power, California was not part of the United States, was taken over. Hawaii was not part of the United States, was taken over.
right,
Puerto Rico was not part of the United States. The Philippines, uh, there are a lot of wealth from other parts of the country that were taken by the United States. So even the times, the reason I mentioned that it's not, sort of put down the United States per se, but when think about, the good times, and then we say now, oh, times are not so good, it's not that simple a comparison. The good times were not good for everybody. But
right.
overall, things have gotten better. And even, something that seems like completely untrue to us. For example, that is, if you ask, well, is there more violence now? So there's a lot of evidence. There's a book by Steven Pinker. He goes through
Yeah,
evidence.
gosh, yeah.
Things are actually less violent, and you probably know that.
Yeah.
So overall things have been better, but the distribution has not quite kept a pace. So I think we certainly could do much, much better given all the um, innovations that we have had, all the discoveries we have had, all the improvements in science. We could certainly do much better than we are doing. So from that point of view, right, where we are and where we could be, that gap doesn't need to be there.
Right.
But I think we're still much better than as a world than we used to be.
Interesting.
Well, one thing I want to say about something else that's happening simultaneously, right? I mean, along with the coronavirus, the last few weeks, there's been a resurgence of the Black Lives Matter
Right.
movement, which is triggered by police violence, etc.
Yeah.
And now it's not just people of color demonstrating. There's a general agreement throughout a lot of American society and maybe even all over the world that things cannot continue as they are. And the reason I'm mentioning all of that is that perhaps that might be the catalyst for a reduction of inequality
Right.
in income and wealth.
Right.
So, that might in fact also then be the way to get to the sweet spot that you were asking about.
Yeah.
Can we say enough is enough? In certain ways, now we are saying enough is enough, right? In
Right.
terms of racism
Yeah.
and disadvantage for particular people. Maybe we can go more in that direction and say we don't need as much consumption.
I'm pretty sure this is the only podcast where Steven Pinker and Black Lives Matter have been mentioned in the same 5 minutes.
True that.
They're connected.
I know, but it's usually, they don't usually end up on the same in the same interview.
Yeah. Wow. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, we could talk about this for hours.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
here's another question. Can the federal government just keep bailing out people and corporations every time there's a recession?
Well, in principle, it could, right? Because the federal government. But the other reason it could is because, as I was saying earlier, to a certain extent, the U.S. is like a closed system, right? I mean, it is true that we do export to other countries and we import from other countries, so it's not completely closed. But the U.S. economy is really, really large, and to a large extent, it's closed. So this means that when we talk about the federal government bailing out people, it's not like individual A paying individual B. It's if you had a father and he had two daughters, and one daughter was spendthrift and the other daughter was careful, she didn't spend more than she earned, etc. And so the spendthrift daughter always had to have the father bail her out. Then you could ask how long is this going to go? I mean, at some point the father is going to run out of resources to bail out the spendthrift daughter, right?
Yeah.
That would make sense. But here, because we are talking about a closed system, so a bailout simply means that there's money going from one part of the economy to another part
Right.
of the economy. So where does the federal government get its money from? Pretty much the way it gets its money is through taxes. And so now, so now if the federal government, let's say it passes, or the Congress passes laws that reduce taxes on the wealthy, right? Or they say that it's okay. You don't have to worry about pollution. You don't have to worry about the environment when you produce things, right? So all of those things are going to cause a transfer of resources to people who are already well-to-do, to capitalists, right? And that money is then going to come from the general population that is going to be paying taxes. So what happens when, with this bailing out is essentially money, resources going from one part of the economy, from one group of people to another group of people.
Right.
Mm.
And what we have to make sure is that the flow of the money goes in the direction of the people who are hurting and who are being affected through no fault of their own and who cannot help themselves. And it comes from the other people who are able to provide those resources.
Right.
So, I mean, so the complaint about bailing out people really is a complaint about bailing out people who are already doing well and who might have themselves caused the situation that one might be in. Not this time, I mean, nobody caused the coronavirus
Right.
in the United States.
Right.
But, with the mortgage crisis, for example, one could say, who caused all this and who's affected by it?
Right.
And it seems like that's different.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, this would be a great segue to monetary theory, but that would also be a great segue into spending another hour on this.
Yeah, I know.
But it's there's a lot to unpack in that answer that we don't have time for.
Right.
I do want to say one thing, which is that, I think we spend too much time in talking about the financial sector. We spend too much time talking about the stock market, the futures market, debt and equity and things like that. And those are just, I mean, debt and equity is simply ways of deciding what part of the pie, who gets what part of the pie. So if you own debt of a company, you get the first slice.
Right.
People who own the equity of the company, right, they get the second slice, third slice, fourth slice, and the company is doing really well, they get all of that.
Right.
But that's all it is. Now, the stock, why do you have a stock market? The only reason you really have a stock market is so that it's easier to actually raise capital when you need it. That's one thing. The other thing is that you keep stock market keeps buying and people keep buying and selling so that things are priced properly. But there's just so much money that's poured into the operation of these financial markets is completely unnecessary. And part of it is because people fetishize the market. They think, oh, that's the way that we are going to make money.
Mm.
I think if we looked more at the real part of the economy, we look more at the production of services, the production of art, the production of goods and services, shoes, computers, all these sorts of things. How can we do that better? And we put a premium on that, and the best kids say, oh, that's what I want to be. I want to be an engineer, which used to be the case at one time. I want to go into space research, right? I think that's the way our economy and our society will get ahead.
So, what are we? What should we look forward to? How is this going to end? How is this going to play out? Obviously, we don't know, but we can assume and speculate on how it's going to end. But think about it this way: in a couple of months, the bailout money is going to run out. The PPP money, the Paycheck Protection Program loans that were given to companies to pay employees are going to run out, and they're going to end. The enhanced unemployment is going to end. The $1,200, obviously,
Yeah.
$1,200 that everybody got is probably long gone. What happened then?
I think that's where there's another tie-in. Personally, I think there's another tie-in between the coronavirus and Black Lives Matter. I think it's not going to be that easy this time around to say, let's not worry about the people who are hurting. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to make sure that if for whatever reason we can't go back to normal or something close to normal and people's livelihoods are affected, there's going to be pressure to make sure that the pain is not felt so much by people at the lower end. I mean, I think it's going to be more and more difficult the longer the situation drags on. but at some point we're going to have a vaccine. We're going to have further down the road, we're going to have a cure. We're going to be able to figure out how to operate with some kind of social distancing. So I think there's going to be a slow uh, upswing, not a V recovery, but some kind of a U recovery, maybe even a very gradual U recovery. That's definitely going to happen again because of what I mentioned earlier about the resilience of the US economy and all the smart people who are here. But the key will be to make sure that while that is happening, we don't make disadvantaged people bear the brunt
Yeah,
of the pain.
the skeptic in me is not holding my breath that
Yeah.
Republicans are going to approve another.
No.
That we're going to have some kind of like New Deal or Green New Deal anytime soon.
Right.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me like
Yeah.
August, September, October, November is going to be pretty freaking brutal.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really worried about what's going to happen when the economy opens up. We've seen in other parts of the world and in the United States as well, those parts that have opened up have seen more cases of coronavirus. So yeah, I'm not all that sanguine that in a couple of months everything is going to be hunky dory. But I will say I don't think in terms of um, making sure that people are protected. I don't think we need to depend upon Republicans or certain congressmen or certain um, individuals. I think we can depend upon democracy and the willingness of people to speak up and fight for what they see is their right, and that's why I'm um, much more optimistic now than I might have been in the past because people have said, that's it. We're not going to lie down and take it. So there's a lot of interesting things we're going to be seeing in the future, and we're going to be seeing, amazing things simply because, things are have changed so much now. The way we've done things in the past cannot be the way
Right.
things will be done in the future. So I'm sure we'll come up with
Yeah.
fantastic discoveries.
We had a somewhat silly question about the countries that are considering paying for trips and how that would impact the economy. But it seems to me that it's a moot point.
It's actually an important question. There are two things. One is this is part of what I was saying earlier about what is the world going to look like going forward, and the question here is what is tourism going to look like going forward, and maybe there'll be more people I mean, there are going to be fewer people traveling. I think at least for the next few years. But maybe there's going to be a lot of different kinds of traveling. Maybe we'll travel by looking at museums in different places. We'll be more willing to see the beautiful parts of other countries sitting in our living room. But also, I think for countries that have that do depend a lot on tourism, they probably will realize. I mean, and I think this is what we are seeing with Japan and Sicily paying for part of your trip. They'll what's happening there is they're realizing that tourism is so important for the country as a whole. They cannot have the pain being felt by the immediate providers of tourism and tourism services. So
France can't survive without tourism. They just can't. They just don't have the money to survive without tourism. Like, what's something like France or Italy gonna do? Yeah.
I mean, I do believe that people are gonna go back to traveling, but I saw something really interesting. Airbnb experiences, I think they call it. They have tourism where people in Prague. I saw this particular guy in Prague takes you on a night tour in the city, and it's so popular. So I guess tourism is already happening from your living room.
right, yeah, I mean you're going to have much more of that. I've been I've been doing a lot more learning now than I used to. At one time, if you wanted to do Talmud, you used to go to a shiur, and there's maybe travel some distance, etc. Now you're sitting in your living room and you're exposed to all this amazing stuff. I've taken so many courses online, and I've learned so much about so many things that I wouldn't have thought of before. I think there's going to be even more of that happening.
Well, this has been incredible, and thank you so much. If time wasn't flying that much, we would have asked you another 20 questions.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Yes. Thank you so much, Professor. This was absolutely eye opening, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Sure. Cool too. Right.
So that was our conversation with Professor Viswanath. Thank you so much for listening.
And thank you to my wonderful boyfriend, Josef Horowitz, for not ruining it, by staying quiet this whole time we were recording the podcast.
God, he's so nice.
He's a doll.
He's such a doll. And thanks to Gideon for the countless hours he put in recording the intro and editing the podcast, and to Sky Media and Design for the cover art.
Stay tuned, because we might do another episode in the future when we see how the coronavirus actually affected the economy.
Yeah, and we were thinking about doing a bonus episode about actors and Hollywood and the entertainment industry and how that might work. We're still figuring that out, but we might do it. And if we do, we will post it. We will keep you posted.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bada bing, bada bing.
Biddy bum.